Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to finally give my review of Hwei, our newest champion in League of Legends, and give you guys my thoughts as per normal. That said, Hwei is anything but normal. Though I've taken my normal half week or so to play Hwei as much as possible, I still don't feel like I perfectly understand the champion. I don't normally try to become excellent on the champion for these videos. They're more intended to be first impressions. The champion is going to change and evolve and grow as the community get more and more games on them. But Hwei is a very hard champion to get a grip on after only a few games. He isn't necessarily the most technically demanding champion League of Legends has ever released, but the amount of mental space players need to dedicate to Hwei while playing him makes him one of the most complex champions we've ever seen, possibly even the most complex champion ever. As a result, take everything I say today with a little bit of a grain of salt, as I do feel like a lot more is going to change with Hwei throughout the years, but either way, with all that aside, let's go ahead and jump right into the review, starting off with the pros. First, Hwei is designed to be complex by design. Riot didn't like back into it accidentally by saying, what if we made a champion that can dash after every auto attack, and then realized they'd created a micro monstrosity. Riot decided off the cuff, we want to make a sort of in League of Legends version of Invoker, we want a spell book focused mage, and we are going to design for that. As a result, I think Hwei's kit is designed to be complicated without being needlessly complicated. He has a lot of moving parts, but they all sort of come together and mesh together very well. I also think that Hwei is not exceptionally difficult to pick up and press buttons on because of how Riot designed him. Other complicated champions like Azir and Kalista are like actively hostile to new players. If you pick Azir without even remotely reading what he does or not trying to figure out how to pilot him, you're going to have a bad time. Like, you're not even going to enjoy playing Azir. Conversely, I think Hwei is in that sweet spot of he's complicated, sure, but at least you can press buttons on him and feel relatively good about him. Right, I've also programmed in a decent amount of utility for newer players. His spam buttons, the QQ, WW, and EE, are generally some of his better outputs and don't take a lot of time to figure out, and they're generally the best thing that you can be using in a panic scenario where you're not thinking about which tool you need to select. This then means that Hwei is a relatively easy champion to just pick up and play. Hwei's abilities are also relatively simple. There's like one ability per mood that requires a little bit more comprehension and requires you to read the tooltip a little bit more. Devastating Bolt, for example, or Severing Bolt, for example, he has too many abilities, you see, is one of those abilities that I think requires you to read a little bit to realize, okay, there's a bonus for immobilized or low health enemy champions or isolated champions. That's it. The E, I think it's like the EW is a little bit complicated to figure out how that ability is best used. But most of Hwei's other buttons are all perfectly usable. You can just kind of press them and get value and understand immediately exactly how to use them best, which I do think is a very good good example for Hwei to set. And that he's extremely complicated, but he does have some things making him simpler. I also like the way in which Riot grouped his abilities, having them into damage, utility, and crowd control respectively, meaning that you don't necessarily have to memorize all of his buttons. As long as you're thinking to yourself, I want damage right now, press Q first, and anything you press afterwards is going to be damage focused. And despite Hwei having 12 separate abilities, he nonetheless doesn't feel like he can do everything all at once. We've had champion releases before where the champion comes out and does everything. They're a ranged melee, tanky, DPS, assassin, mage, tank, support, jungler, all at the same time. Hwei has a million abilities, but still feels like he occupies a distinct niche as a traditional enchanter. He doesn't really have like the face-melting DPS of a Ryze, he doesn't have the burst potential of Lux, nor does he have the range of Xerath. He instead feels like a mage, sort of like a mage that you would have back in the original days of League of Legends, where there's some damage, there's some utility, there's some CC, but generally the mage is more well-rounded. This does mean that Hwei theoretically could start crowding out other traditional mages like Victor that don't really do everything, or that don't do a specific thing, and as a result Hwei does so many more things than them that there's a difficulty to justify playing them. But in general, I think that Hwei, as a traditional mage, therefore, occupies a very good place in League of Legends, and it's a good way in which Riot have designed him to make sure that he doesn't have access to everything. Hwei therefore also feels like he has deliberate weaknesses. He's not the strongest when getting dove, he doesn't have exceptional range, he's more of a mid-range mage overall, W or QW notwithstanding, and he doesn't have exceptionally powerful CC or damage on a single cooldown with the possible exception of his ultimate. This jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none thing means that Hwei is playable in lots of scenarios, but not playable in hyper-specific scenarios where you really want a DPS mage or a artillery mage to really rain devastation down from on high if you're playing like a poke comp, for example. I also like that Hwei isn't necessarily a dedicated support champion, but that he is still playable there. WW is a potent defensive cooldown for champions that can hold their ground. WQ can be used to quickly reposition in the event of a gank. EW, I think, is much more powerful on support Hwei than on mid lane Hwei, because support Hwei is going to be using it more often to check bushes in order to scout out for enemy champions. Like, Hwei, I think it's good that he is playable there. I don't think he's particularly good there. It does feel a little janky, but he feels more at home there than some other mages that have shown a bot lane, like Xerath, for example. Finally, I think Hwei's characterization was done very well. I think he's a fascinating character, mostly with regards to his comparison to Jhin. The idea that Jhin is sort of a temptation for Hwei, because Jhin just lives his life and makes his art the way he wants to, even though his art has a body count. Hwei's art can easily have a body count, and he specifically is trying to not go all out. But that means he doesn't create with so much of a reckless abandon that Jhin does, and doesn't create as much or let himself feel as deeply as Jhin can. And that sort of enticingness of Jhin has an interesting effect on Hwei as he tries to navigate this interesting pitfalls between not being true to yourself and your art, but also going too far and maybe having your art do bad things to people. The fact that Hwei is obsessed with 3 and Jhin is obsessed with 4 is also a good little comparison, and I'm very much so looking forward to their sort of individual stories tied together and seeing how they interact with each other in the future, assuming, of course, Riot write any lore for those two, is sort of the big problem. But there are some disadvantages to Hwei, of course, and number one of which is that he is complexity at an all-time high. Picking up Hwei and pressing buttons isn't bad, but actually learning the champion promises to take dozens of games and hundreds of hours, unlike some of the other champions released this year. This isn't necessarily a bad thing if you are hungry for a champion that you want to spend hundreds of games with. Like, that's totally fine, but it does mean that if you're looking for a casual relationship with a champion because you just want to pick up and play him because he looks cool, you like his thematic, you're gonna have a bad time unless you're repeatedly playing Hwei and trying to remember what he does. And this is part of the issue, is because he has so many buttons. Remembering 4 abilities isn't so bad. Remembering 6 for form swap champions like Jace or Elise is a bit of a stretch, but doable. Remembering 12 individual abilities for Hwei is quite difficult. There's almost always at least one ability that you're not remembering that would have been incredibly useful to have in a given moment, but you cast a different one instead and then realize, oh crap, I should have done this instead. Having 3 different abilities also bound to 1 button means there's also an opportunity cost to using an ability. Hwei demands you think carefully about your ability usage lest you fire off the wrong spell for the job. This is partially mitigated by his relatively short cooldowns, but his cooldowns are just long enough that an improper ability use will hurt you. As an example, if you get ganked in the mid lane, do you use your EW to try and root an enemy champion, or an EQ to peel one of them off temporarily, or EE to try and pull both of them away? Do you use your WQ for movement speed, or a WW for a shield to try and hold your ground? Do you use a QQ to just burst somebody and maybe get them to back off, or a QE to make a dangerous no-go zone for them to pursue you through? You can't pick all of those options. You only get 3, 1 per button, so you have to try and make the right decision. And of course, remembering what you have at your disposal in the heat of a fight is not the simplest thing. Again, Riot made the spam buttons relatively good choices, but oftentimes you'll realize, oh, the spam button was not the correct choice in that scenario, but you were panicked and you couldn't remember what all of his buttons did. Mechanically, casting your abilities on Hwei also has some quirks. He requires 2 buttons to be pressed for all of his abilities save his ultimate, and as a result he can feel a little bit sluggish to respond to things, because you don't want to fat finger the wrong mood as well. Pressing the first button is a very deliberate action which slows you down further, and then trying to remember the exact hotkeys to get to your desired ability is a bit of a bear. You know Q is damage, but which one's the long range snipe? Oh, that's W. Okay, so Q and they're out of range, right? There are some issues with just trying to press buttons. Also, rapid fire tapping abilities has some quirks. The first button press is deliberate, but the second one is a spam cast. League of Legends doesn't normally have you be super precise with your button presses. Usually it's just when it's off cooldown, Q, 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 Q to just make sure the ability goes off. That said, though, if you play Hwei in that regard, say for example you're going Q, W, 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 W to try and snipe a low health enemy champion, the W will go off, and then you'll have pressed W an extra time, entering you into the W mood, and if you don't notice, and then try to go Q for a damage ability, but you're accidentally casting your EQ, and then you're realizing, oops, I didn't mean to do that, and if it's potentially a high impact scenario, well, you've screwed yourself, right? You've cast an ability, and now you don't even get your W cooldowns instead. There are some issues with this, of course. And then if you do catch it, you have to remember which key is the wash brush button, which is an R key, so if you accidentally rapid fire to just cleanse your brush, you might accidentally throw your ultimate off. There are just a lot of issues inherent with how Hwei plays in comparison to other League of Legends champions that we've never seen before. No other champion really does this, but exists now and is a quirk of trying to play the champion. All this also means that Hwei is going to be a nightmare to face when piloted by a player who really knows him. He has a ton of options, but selecting the right option for the job is tricky, but if you always know what the right option is, you're going to have a field day. This is doubly true because most every other player in the game isn't going to have a categorical memory of every single one of Hwei's abilities. He has 12 of them. One of the strengths of League of Legends is that champions only have 4 abilities. Once you've seen all 4, you know what the champion is capable of. Hwei just keeps pulling out additional abilities out of pockets, and if you're not used to him, you're not going to know that he has something. And I can certainly see feels bad scenarios where Hwei is sniping you under your tower with a QW, or fearing you away with an EQ, and you're like, I didn't even know he could do that. And as a result of this, the most damning thing I can say about Hwei is that he doesn't feel like a League of Legends champion. Riot have made it very clear that basically every champion of the game has, at most, 3 buttons to worry about most of the time, and a 4th to worry about on occasion. And as a result, champions are these neatly little packed nuggets of mechanics, right? You can look at a champion and sort of preload in your brain exactly what that character does. And if those champions are all mouthfuls, Hwei is too big of a bite. It's impossible to remember everything he's going to do off the cuff, and even if you do, keeping it all in mind, especially when the game has taught you only 4 abilities for the longest period of time, is going to be very difficult. Aphelios was the other major departure from Riot's normal formula, but at least Aphelios was more about right-clicking and less about remembering exact inputs. Hwei, meanwhile, feels like an MMO character. You have so many things to keep track of and so many options at a given moment, but League of Legends is too fast-paced, in my opinion, for such a cerebral champion. Ultimately, though, I think it's still too early to call anything regarding Hwei. He has the opportunity to be a meta-defining champion, a pub stomper, a pro-play nightmare, an underplayed champion, or all of the above, like, at the same time. Though I'm critical of Riot for releasing such a non-League of Legends champion into League of Legends, I do appreciate their desire to add more complex characters into the game, and I feel like Hwei, from a design perspective at least, is done as well as he possibly can be given the concept. Even though we've been here before with Briar, who breaks the rules of League of Legends, but I feel like is in a bad way, nerfed in 5 of the last 6 patches, by the way, I feel like Hwei is more grounded and less experimental. He has a ton of abilities, sure, but it's still part and parcel of what League of Legends allows. And he can't even use all of his abilities in a single rotation, which does make him feel a little bit more fair than some of his other contemporaries. As a result, I think Hwei is a champion I will continue to keep a close eye on, because I feel like, one way or another, his mark on the game will be indelible. But you guys let them know what you think of Hwei down in the comment section below, how you've been building him, where you've been playing him, and what you think of Riot's first champion with a million abilities. Let me know all that down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.